Welcome, everyone. It's Alex, your host, and today we are getting straight to it. We are exploring why critical thinking is absolutely the ultimate toolkit for economics. You know, you hear the term critical thinking thrown around constantly in education, almost like a cliche. But today, we are going to get incredibly precise about what it actually means, why it's completely indispensable when you're looking at markets and policy, and exactly how you can actively strengthen it. Think of this as the foundations of critical thinking. Because here's the thing, this isn't just some supplementary skill. It is literally the intellectual infrastructure of the entire discipline. So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll be decoding critical thinking. Second, we'll break down its 3 foundational pillars. Third, we're diving into the ethical core, which is social responsibility. Fourth, we'll look at the famous Reinhardt-Rogoff case study. And finally, number 5, I'll give you a practical 5-step evaluation checklist. Let's get into it. Section 1, Decoding Critical Thinking, moving from a buzzword to a practical tool. Okay, be honest. Have you ever read an economic argument that just felt wrong? Think about it. You're reading an article about this shiny new policy proposal. Maybe it's a new trade tariff. The argument seems super persuasive, right? It cites all these statistics, it references brilliant authorities, and it reaches this bold, confident conclusion. But somewhere deep down in your gut, something just feels off, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is. Well, listen, that discomfort is actually incredibly valuable. That is the starting point of real critical inquiry. The real question is whether you have the tools to follow that gut feeling through to an actual rigorous conclusion. To get really precise, let's look at how scholar Peter Faccioni defined it back in 1990. He called it purposeful, self-regulating judgment that produces careful interpretation, analysis, evaluation, and inference. Now, in plain English, this is the disciplined habit of asking not just what a claim says, but whether it's actually well supported, logically coherent, and honestly presented in its context. In economics, where models dramatically simplify our messy, complicated reality, data can easily be massaged to support almost any conclusion you want. So having this skill, it's not optional. It is absolutely mandatory. Moving to Section 2, the 3 foundational pillars: knowledge, skills, and dispositions. Researchers have identified these core components that basically function together as an independent system. Pillar number 1 is domain knowledge. You really have to know the vocabulary and the theories. For example, standard models will tell you that raising the minimum wage causes unemployment. Simple, right? But domain knowledge also means knowing the empirical evidence, like David Card and Alan Kruger's landmark 1994 study. They compared fast food jobs in New Jersey, which raised its wage, to Pennsylvania, which didn't. And guess what? They found minimal negative effects. You literally can't evaluate a labor argument without knowing both the standard theory and that specific evidence. The second pillar is skills. These are the cognitive actions you take to spot logical errors. A classic fallacy in economics is post hoc reasoning. That's when someone says GDP went up after policy X, therefore policy X caused the growth. That is a massive logic trap that ignores global trends, technology, the whole shebang. Identifying that is a learned skill. And the third pillar, that's dispositions, which are your internal motivations. Now, what's genuinely fascinating is this insight from researcher Keith Stanovich. Our disposition, specifically our actively open-minded thinking, is actually one of the strongest predictors of reasoning accurately. Dispositions are way harder to develop than knowledge or skills because they require you to examine and sometimes totally tear down your own deeply ingrained habits of mind. It's about being authentically willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it completely wrecks your prior beliefs. I want to contrast 2 incredibly important dispositions for economics here. First up is intellectual humility. This is what stops us from being dangerously overconfident. There's an actual psychological phenomenon called the hard, easy effect, where people tend to be the most overconfident precisely on questions that are objectively difficult, like complex trade or fiscal policy. Intellectual humility is your guardrail against that. Second, we have tolerance of ambiguity. Look, economics is full of genuine, unavoidable uncertainty. Psychologist Ari Kruglansky studied the need for cognitive closure, which is our natural human drive to just find a quick, clean answer and be done with it. He called the risk seizing and freezing on the very first plausible conclusion you see. Tolerance of ambiguity prevents that. It allows you to sit with the discomfort of an answer that is simply, well, it depends. Section 3. The ethical core, specifically social responsibility. This is the absolute anchor of the entire 4-pillar system. With any economic claim, we always have to step back and ask, who bears the cost? Economic models do not exist in a vacuum. They aren't just neat little lines drawn on a chalkboard. They shape real policy that affects real human beings and communities. Social responsibility is the anchor of critical thinking because it forces us to evaluate whose interests are reflected in an analysis, who wins, who loses, and whose interests are being marginalized or ignored entirely. So the crucial point we have to remember is this: rigorous thinking is just thinking. If you're going to evaluate an economic policy that could impact jobs, healthcare, or housing, you need a deep, persistent awareness of social responsibility to ensure the analysis accounts for minority as well as majority perspectives. That ethical core keeps the math grounded in reality, and it stops us from treating vulnerable populations like acceptable rounding errors. Section 4. The Reinhart-Rogoff Case Study. High Stakes and Analytical Failures. Picture this sequence of events. Back in 2010, highly respected economists published a heavily cited paper claiming that countries with a public debt exceeding 90% of their GDP experienced dramatically slower economic growth. Policymakers all across Europe totally seized on this, using it to justify sweeping, aggressive austerity programs. But then, flash forward to 2013. A graduate student named Thomas Herndon was just trying to replicate their analysis for a homework assignment, a literal homework assignment, and he found a critical error in their original Excel spreadsheet. Several countries had simply been inadvertently excluded from the calculations due to a basic coding mistake. Imagine that, a massive global economic policy shift justified by a spreadsheet where someone essentially forgot to highlight all the cells. It is almost unbelievable. The contrast here is just staggering. The flawed claim justified huge, incredibly painful cuts to healthcare, education, and vital social services across entire nations. But the corrected reality, once that single coding error was fixed, was that the massive, terrifying 90% threshold effect largely just vanished. The data simply did not support the panic. This is a textbook example of all 4 pillars of our framework catastrophically failing. First, a skills failure. The initial data preparation was not verified with anywhere near enough rigor. Second, a knowledge failure. The policymakers who aggressively acted on these findings lacked the statistical background to actually scrutinize the methodology themselves. Third, a dispositions failure. There was a massive tendency, across the entire political spectrum, to just embrace findings that confirmed an existing preference for austerity rather than stress testing the claims. And finally, a social responsibility failure. Insufficient attention was paid to who would actually bear the cost if the analysis was wrong. And, as we now know, it was the most economically vulnerable populations who paid the brutal price for an Excel error. Section 5. Your 5-step evaluation checklist. This is your practical toolkit for everyday economics. So here is exactly how you evaluate claims step by step in the real world. Number 1, identify the claim precisely because vague claims resist evaluation. 2, examine the evidence. Is it empirical, is it theoretical, or is it just asserted without any support? 3, identify hidden assumptions. Every single economic model depends on contestable assumptions like rational actors or perfect information. Dig those up. 4, check for logical fallacies. Watch out for that post hoc reasoning, false dichotomies, or straw man arguments. And 5, always ask about distributional consequences. Who actually benefits and who pays the cost? Sound analysis always accounts for distributional effects, not just big aggregate averages. To wrap things up, foundational educational theorist John Dewey described reflective thinking way back in 1910 as the active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief in light of the grounds that support it. This perfectly reminds us that the goal in economics is rarely absolute certainty. Certainty is mostly an illusion in complex markets. The real goal is groundedness. We want conclusions that are proportionate to the evidence, honestly reasoned, and crucially, fully open to revision. I'll leave you with this one final thought. What evidence would cause you to change your mind? Seriously, I want you to ask yourself this question the next time you feel incredibly strongly about an economic issue, whether it's taxation, inequality, or free trade. Because if your answer is that absolutely no evidence could ever change your mind, then you need to realize you are just advocating. You're not analyzing. Keep your mind open, keep testing your assumptions, and always look for the evidence. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will patch you next time.